Ubisoft just slashed their company again, and they say that this is all part of, I quote, a more gamer-centric organization. Now, I have a little feeling it probably isn't gamer-centric in the way that most people would like. And in this year alone, it's going to mean more than €1 billion in losses. And that's not the only cost. The Prince of Persia remake. Yes, that thing. It's now finally been killed, even though apparently it's pretty close to actually being releasable. Just not releasable enough. But it's only one of half a dozen games that have now bit the bullet. Multiple studios are closing down, there's layoffs and stuff at all levels of the company, and the games that they're planning to release are delayed. Yeah, Ubisoft are having fun, and as this new version of them takes shape, well, what we're talking about today is certainly not going to be the last round of cuts. Let's get up to speed. Ubisoft somehow managed to survive 2025. There was Assassin's Creed Shadows, which for all of the noise online actually does seem to have overperformed its financial expectations. Who knows about the long-run performance, but it did what they needed it to do in 2025. And their library actually did manage to deliver as well, even when, say, the free-to-play launch of Rainbow Six Siege and a lackluster autumn lineup didn't really. Basically, they have a humongous back catalogue that just trickles money into their pockets. But as we covered in this video, that wasn't the main story of Ubisoft. The main story was the Guillemot family, and them basically trying to retain control of the company. They had minimized risk, Tencent bailed them out by investing in the newly formed Vantage Studios, and the money that was provided for that was able to solve their outstanding debt issues. They laid off hundreds of staff to reach that point, but things had been looking up. The basic story is they'd have two big releases before the financial year's end, and that would coast Ubisoft out of diminishing losses in 2026 and into profit for financial year 2027. And at the heart of this model was their new structure, which is what they call creative houses. Essentially, it's a new structure for development that gives studios the freedom to work on games a bit more dynamically. It's the sort of thing that all sounds great in paper. But in doing all of that, there has been a cost. That cost is €1 billion in losses this year alone. And as we go through everything in today's video, you'll really see how the losses are mounting. Let's talk about the €1 billion then. That's what Ubisoft are expecting as we now close out the financial year. And it's not really like they expected profit in the first place. Now, the reason for all of this is fairly simple. They've written off costs of 6 projects, they're delaying more projects, and they're closing multiple studios and laying off staff. Staff who, by the way, learned about their layoffs basically when we did. So that's not been fun for them. Now, all of this contributes to a major hit to their finances in the short term. Obviously, doing all of that stuff is fairly expensive. And especially, that's because one of the games that they killed was apparently meant to launch this month. Yes, I mean it. So, insider gaming sources report that at one point, the Prince of Persia Sands of Time remake was scheduled January 16th, 2026. Obviously, that hasn't happened. Essentially, following a review of the game over December and January, leadership pushed the game to March. But then, it was killed. It was killed on the day of the big investor announcement. And alongside it, 3 new IPs have been cancelled, 1 existing IP project is cancelled, and a mobile title. But other than the quantity of layoffs, there's another thing that outnumbers the cancelled games, and that's the delayed ones. 7 more games have been delayed, and one of those was previously scheduled for this financial year. That's a hell of a lot being pushed back, and it very much seems that the worst kept secret, the Black Flag remake, well, won't be out before April at the earliest. And of course, this is just the projects. Let's talk about the studios. Ubisoft Halifax was closed, and that was weeks after the studio voted to unionize. Then Stockholm, where Ubisoft were experimenting with cloud development, will be shut down entirely. Layoffs are coming, or are already in progress at Abu Dhabi, at Red Links, and also at Massive. Massive are the maker of The Division, so it's a hell of a lot, and all of this is part of saving €100 million in fixed costs a year ahead of schedule. Because what this is really all about is Ubisoft getting ready for its future. And it's a future that, they say is gamer-centric, but maybe won't be gamer-centric in the way that you would want. Here's the story Ubisoft are putting forth, right? They're framing these cancellations as an acknowledgement of, and I quote, a persistently more selective AAA market and an increasingly competitive shooter landscape. honestly, like, those things I think are fairly true. We are seeing a fair few AAA failures. There is a lot of competition. Now, their solution to this is, as I said earlier, to become a, quote, more gamer-centric organization structured around creative genres with faster, decentralized decision-making. And a lot of those things do sound good. Faster, decentralized decision-making, that is basically what we all want. Now, what they're doing is doubling down on two core pillars. And I think these core pillars are what they think is gamer-centric. But I'd love to know your take. The core pillars are open-world adventures and gas-native experiences. You may be thinking, what? Ubisoft are gassing us? No, gas means games as a service. Now, this doesn't mean every single game they make is going to be that, but that type of game is the sort of thing that'll be keeping the lights on for them. And those are going to be brought to you by the creative houses that develop and publish their own games, and that will all happen under the watchful eye of Ubisoft's Paris leadership. Now, I want you to take a look at this chart. So, each of these are going to get names eventually, but they're all following the Vantage Studios model, though not necessarily in scope. Vantage's three brands have been positioned as billion-dollar franchises since 2022. They're quite literally defined as billionaire brands on the org chart. As for everything else, well, they're getting a specific type of game as their product, so basically that means the same company who's making Rayman doesn't have to be the same bunch who are making Rainbow Six. What actually goes where? What does all this mean? So Creative House 2 is going to be competitive and cooperative shooters. That means Ghost Recon, Splinter Cell, and The Division. House 3 will have select, sharp, live experiences, which essentially means their existing successes like Brawlhalla, For Honor, The Crew, and a game that you probably forgot about, Skull and Bones. People actually play Skull and Bones. I don't think it's really that many of them, but it's enough of them for seemingly it to be worth doing. I think it's just one of those games that is away in its own corner of the internet where the rest of us just don't really hear about it. Then there's Creative House 4, which I think we may as well just label as other. Ubisoft are framing them as immersive fantasy worlds and narrative-driven universes. But I think in practice that's going to mean strategy games like Anno, Might and Magic, maybe the odd Rayman, Prince of Persia, and, of course, Beyond Good and Evil, which still exists. Yeah, I know. Maybe it'll come out before 2050. Then there's Creative House 5. That's casual games like Just Dance. And all of these will report directly to Ubisoft HQ whilst being supported by their creative network, which basically means internal outsourcing for manpower and then core services for like production, finance, technology, and that kind of thing. So that's the structure. With all of that structure being set up, you may be wondering, why was Sands of Time cancelled? You could have launched it. Well, you can see that the team working on it are talking about it in social media, and they are saying the franchise will continue. They want to keep making Prince of Persia games. So why not just hand another team the work so far, or let the people at Ubisoft Montreal, you know, a studio that sure can actually make games, keep going and finish the thing? Well, the reason is that team alone had already given the thing 4 years. Yes, 4 years. And in this new Ubisoft's view, they could be working on something that is just a more provable IP. They could be putting resources into a game more likely to generate a outsized return. But even so, why not hand it over to one of the Creative House 4 studios? Well, if you did, you'd just be hanging a big milestone around their neck and giving them a hell project that's already faced many, many years of chaos. It may not be the best way to kick off a new business unit that is expected to be financially sustainable in its own right. And if all of this seems like a plan rapidly cobbled together, well, I wouldn't be surprised if it is. I mean, as of the announcement, staff don't even know where they are going. I think there's a logic underwriting all of this. And that logic is pain now over pain later. Here's the principle of things. If Ubisoft as a publishing group take these hits now, then the creative houses don't have to make those hard choices later, and they actually get to be successful business units. It would mean that when they come into existence in April, they would be doing that with as positive a balance sheet and release schedule as is, well, possible. I think that's essentially the plan. And that means the games coming out in fiscal year 27 get more dev time, more polish, and more time for developers to adjust to the new structure. That is basically how this would benefit the creative houses, the new structure, at least in theory. You see, each of these creative houses is also, and perhaps more importantly, a vehicle for internal investment, like with, say, the Tencent stuff that we've talked about. That may mean partnerships, as we've seen with Might and Magic and Hooded Horse, but it might also mean just selling off some brands. Ubisoft are leaving divestors as open options, basically means that more publishers like, say, Atari can just comb through their back catalogue for games that are on that creative house's list. And to break analyst mode for a second, I think I need to acknowledge the obvious thing that we're probably all thinking as regular people. This is all just owned by Ubisoft, and it does feel like a bunch of, yes, we've split ourselves up, I don't know, like Cell Division, and we now own all of these things, and it all does feel like, business structure, corporate tomfoolery. And I suppose, in a way, it is. Because obviously Ubisoft itself does own all of these companies. And Ubisoft still reports group-wide profit and loss. They're still on the hook for the cost of all of this stuff, and now they're saying that recovery is going to take longer than anticipated. Yes, that's also a thing that they've said in this recent big wave of talking about investors and businessy things. And that's why this won't be the end of the cost-cutting. They are ahead of their current plans for €100 million in savings by 2027, but they're already rolling out what they call, quote, a third and final phase. If you work at Ubisoft, that's what I think we call a threat. Now that phase is to be another €200 million in costs, all to be cut by March 2028. And as Stephen Totillo at GameFile has pointed out, since this plan started, it's meant 3,000 layoffs, saving €300 million. And in total what it comes to is Ubisoft wanting to go from €1.75 billion in costs in 2023 to $1.25 billion in costs by 2028. Now that likely means another 2,000 staff need to go by fiscal 28 alongside real estate sales and efficiency, which is of course why a lot of generative AI, as an investor-friendly buzzword, is also part of all of these announcements, because of course it is. And while you may think, oh man, look at that, they're ahead of schedule on that 100 million we talked about. Surely they don't have to do everything right now. Surely they can do it slowly and efficiently. No, the Phase 3 things are actually starting now. Anyone still at Ubisoft is going to be required back in the office 5 days a week with a set number of days per year that they can work from home. This is to, quote, boost the collective performance for AAA. Now, whenever you're changing the conditions of work, you're changing basically someone's employment terms, or agreement, that obviously will lead to a lot of people deciding, you know what, this no longer makes sense for what I want out of my career and my life, I'm going to go and look somewhere else. That's one of the ways in which this is a classic soft layoff technique, where basically you're removing staff who maybe would need additional accommodations without having to fire them directly. And that's the sort of thing they'll have to do because, well, this sounds funny, but because of something that's good, Ubisoft's CFO confirmed they're at, quote, the lowest historical levels of staff attrition, and this is down from a peak in 2022. Is that because Ubisoft is suddenly a magical place to work, or is it because there's been a lot of layoffs in the industry, hiring is still really weak, so obviously people will not want to, go find a job elsewhere. That's way harder. So if you're to ask me, it's a case of low staff attrition because staff basically don't have anywhere else to go, which may not be a great sign for how happy they are in the company, and I bring all of this up because based on everything that we've seen, staff may actually be Ubisoft's largest problem. Here's how staff are a problem. At the time of the announcement, people did not know what creative house their project would be lumped into. This is the sort of thing that is a big corporate decision, but it doesn't seem that they have a lot of buy-in for it. It would be hard to get buy-in for any of this planning in a world where staff don't even know where they're going to be going. And of course, Ubisoft's union-backed staff across Europe and Scandinavia are fairly quick to tell leadership when they think they're wrong. They're already planning protests, they're already calling for strikes, and as this restructuring rumbles on, expect more and more pushback. But there is another problem looming as well. We don't know who's going to run these creative houses, and we have seen evidence in recent weeks that Ubisoft are losing a lot of their heavy hitter talent. People who have been there for a long time, and people who have played a major role in saving or salvaging projects. We have a deep dive on that coming soon, as it could be a real big problem for them. Now, all of these changes are about one thing: the Guillemot's gamble on guaranteed short-term pain for long-term success. Question, though, is whether enough of Ubisoft's workforce and library survives to see it pay off, and of course, as far as you and I are concerned, pay off in the form of high-quality games that are worth your time. Who knows if that will happen? And speaking of confusion, who knows that Highguard is coming out next week? I expect literally several of you. There's been a lot of, I'm going to say, anti-buzz about the game. If you want to cut through a lot of the noise, though, and actually see what's going on and some of the fun arrangements of the Game Awards, watch this video next.